Hello and welcome to the Cash News Podcast, your go-to source for informative conversations about all things cash and currency. From cash security and payments technology to the cash supply chain, we're here to share insights on the issues shaping the world of cash today. Join your hosts, Tom Meehan, Sean Ferrari, and Brad Moody, as they dive into the latest trends, strategies, and technology. This is the Cash News Podcast. Now, here's Tom, Sean, and...
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. If you, like us, feel like the news cycle has become just this relentless, kind of chaotic mix of global conflict, unprecedented weather events...
Yeah.
I mean, seriously, who prepares for a foot of rain in 24 hours?
Right. It's unbelievable.
And then you've got the lingering pandemic fallout, tightening security measures worldwide.
Yeah.
You get it. You understand the foundational problem facing, well, pretty much every organization today.
It really is more than just chaos. It feels like a constant state of flux. And for businesses, that flux translates directly into rapidly evolving, multifaceted risks. The standard playbooks, the ones written even, say, 5 years ago, they're frankly, pretty obsolete now.
Exactly. And that urgency, that feeling, brings us right to the core of our deep dive today, business resilience strategy in this hyper-accelerated world we're living in.
Yeah.
So our mission today is built on some really powerful material focusing on organizational resilience and security guidance. We're looking particularly at insights from experts like Tom Meehan, CFI.
Tom's work is crucial here.
He and his colleagues argue something really important and maybe a bit uncomfortable, that the current risks we face are so uniquely combined that just relying on historical experience, what worked in the past for preparation, it's actually dangerous.
Dangerous. That's a strong word, but it breeds this false sense of security, right? Complacency.
Complacency, exactly.
And what's fascinating, I think, is the sheer velocity of threat evolution. It's just so fast now, whether we're talking physical security or environmental threats, cyber attacks. The timeline you have to adapt, it's basically shrinking to zero.
Right.
So we're looking at material that really pushes organizations past just surviving a single event. It's more towards adopting a philosophy of continuous dynamic development. Resilience isn't static.
And that sets up the central tension we really want to explore today.
Yeah.
You've got these threats, cyber, physical, all of them evolving with just breathtaking speed. Yet the strategy you need to manage them, it has to be kept simple enough to actually implement, actionable enough to matter, and maybe most crucially, it needs to be continually adjusted.
That's the trick, isn't it? Simple but flexible.
Yeah. So we're going to spend this time really uncovering why static resilience is, essentially a myth, and how we move toward this more dynamic living capability.
Okay, let's start with that really crucial point you just raised. Tom Meehan, being a certified fraud investigator, a CFI, he focuses heavily on integrating physical and cyber defenses.
Right, not treating them as separate things.
Exactly, and that synthesis, that integration, it underpins this entire approach we're talking about. You just cannot address only half the threat landscape and, expect to survive long term.
Makes sense.
So we're diving into the why, and maybe more importantly, the how of keeping that resilience strategy truly relevant right now, today.
Okay, let's unpack this idea of historical complacency first. It feels a bit counterintuitive, doesn't it? I mean, every business seminar, every history class tells you, learn from the past.
Right? Those who don't know history.
Exactly. So why does that wisdom suddenly become a liability now?
That's the core trap, really, that the source material warns against so strongly. History, look, it offers invaluable lessons, no doubt, but its value drops, significantly when you face a completely novel combination of threats.
Combination, okay.
Think about it this way. Our ancestors, they dealt with plagues, wars, economic depressions, terrible things.
Sure.
But they never dealt with, say, an instantaneous globalized supply chain shutdown happening at the same time as AI-driven deepfake misinformation campaigns and major geopolitical fragmentation and unprecedented weather. It's the mix.
So it's not that the individual components are entirely new, like we've never seen pandemics or economic trouble before.
Yeah.
It's the cocktail. It's the specific blend hitting all at once. We're facing a world where digital hyperconnectivity meets accelerating climate volatility.
Yeah.
all layered over these massive economic shifts and rebalancing. You just can't look up the 1918 pandemic playbook and expect it to solve a 2025 crisis that shuts down your cloud servers while a hurricane is simultaneously leveling your regional warehouse.
Precisely. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the environment, the entire context in which your business operates, it's fundamentally non-static. It's always moving.
Always changing.
Absolutely. So consider a security strategy or even just a basic business continuity plan that you might have put in place, say, 2 years ago.
Okay.
Was it prepared for the lightning-fast emergence of generative AI and the threats that come with it?
Probably not explicit.
Was it prepared for a sudden, sharp reversal of decades of, basically free trade policy?
Unlikely.
Was it prepared for that foot of rain in one day?
Definitely not. So that 2-year-old strategy, no matter how solid it felt when you wrote it, is already potentially weak, maybe even dangerously weak, because the world itself has changed underneath it. You've got new technologies, major economic shifts, fresh geopolitical tensions popping up, and those massive environmental changes we keep seeing.
And this brings us to a really fundamental concept distinction here: resilience. It's often misunderstood. People think of it as a static quality an organization has, like a badge.
You survived the last downturn, check, we're resilient.
Exactly. It's a box you tick. We weathered the storm, so we are resilient, done.
But the source material we're looking at, it defines true resilience as something quite different. It's not just static survival.
No, it must be defined really as a capability, something that is dynamically and continuously developed.
Dynamically and continuously developed.
Yeah.
Okay, let's make that distinction more concrete. What's the difference?
Okay, so a statically resilient structure, think of it like this. It's one that can survive a single big hit. It has great flood walls, maybe, or redundant power backups. It bounces back once from one specific type of event.
Right. Like a rubber band that you stretch once and it snaps back into its original shape.
That's a perfect analogy, exactly. But a dynamic, resilient capability, that's different. It's one that fundamentally changes its operating model, maybe even its core business, while a long-term crisis is ongoing.
So it adapts during the stress, not just recovers after.
Precisely. It doesn't just return to the previous state. It evolves. It becomes a stronger, adapted structure. Think of those businesses that didn't just, survive the pandemic, but they permanently shifted their workforce model. They digitized their supply chains. They learned to manage operations entirely remotely.
Right. They came out the other side fundamentally different, maybe even better positioned in some ways.
That operational pivot, that's dynamic resilience in action, they changed because of the pressure, not just withstood it.
And the devastating period of COVID-19 really drove home the critical importance of this shift, didn't it? It was the ultimate long-term systemic shock.
Absolutely. The pandemic didn't just expose, say, supply chain weaknesses, which it definitely did.
Oh, yeah.
It exposed weaknesses in internal communication, in technological infrastructure, especially things like remote access security. And critically, it tested staff psychological resilience to the limit. So bouncing back from that, it required, and frankly, it continues to require, scrutinizing absolutely all parts of the business. You can't just fix one silo, like the supply chain, and declare victory.
Right. If your HR and IT departments aren't talking, for example, then a big shift to remote work suddenly becomes a massive security vulnerability, even if the tech could support it.
Exactly. It has to be integrated.
So, okay, what does this continuous adjustment actually mean for a business day-to-day, for their budget, their strategy meetings?
Well, it means the goal shifts. It shifts away from just crisis response, that panicky reactive mode when something hits the fan.
Right, firefighting.
Towards strategic forethought. Planning ahead.
Okay.
This whole continuous adjustment philosophy, it allows businesses to act with that forethought and, crucially, allocate resources proactively. The source material uses this great phrase, damage control beforehand.
Damage control beforehand. I like that. It sounds simple, but the implications.
They're huge. Instead of just waiting for the inevitable threat to materialize because something will happen eventually,
right,
you are pre-allocating financial resources, logistical resources, training time based on anticipated scenarios you've thought through.
It implies a massive operational and honestly a cultural shift within the company.
It really does.
It means having your response procedures buttoned down, your communication lines clear, your emergency funds may be pre-positioned.
Yeah.
So when the crisis actually hits, you're executing a plan you've practiced, not scrambling to invent one on the fly.
That proactivity, it changes everything. It means, for instance, when a major geopolitical tension suddenly escalates, your legal team doesn't start digging through files. They already know which specific export licenses might be revoked. And your operations team, they've already sourced potential alternative manufacturing partners in different regions.
Oh, okay. That's a different level of preparedness.
It allows for a strategic deployment of resources instead of being pulled into multiple expensive reactive directions all at once. And that commitment, that dedication to continuous strategy development, it really is the only way to maintain relevance, maybe even survival, in this volatile environment we're in.
Okay, so we've established that strategy must be dynamic, constantly adapting. But how do you manage that? We need a simple kind of unifying tool to organize all this incoming complexity. We can't just sit around worrying vaguely about everything.
Exactly. And this is where we take all that complexity and try to apply some structure. The PESTLE framework. It's really an invaluable tool for helping organizations categorize the enormous variety of potential external threats.
External threats, right? Not just internal stuff.
Crucially external. The material really emphasizes that all organizations, big or small, are susceptible to these external influences from really diverse sources.
Yeah.
And, those influences, they don't respect internal business functions or department lines.
How do you mean?
Well, like a political shift in government policy can drastically impact your technological vulnerability overnight. Or an environmental disaster can create huge social issues for your workforce. They're interconnected.
So PESTLE essentially forces you to look outside your own firewall, literally and figuratively, and outside your four walls.
Precisely. It stops you from getting tunnel vision, focusing only on your direct competitors or your immediate customers, and makes you analyze the massive forces acting on the market, on society, on the environment as a whole.
It gives you a kind of roadmap then for scanning the horizon.
Exactly. A structured way to scan. You use those 6 letters, PESTEL, to analyze the full spectrum of risk.
Okay, let's list them out for everyone. Those 6 key areas are political,
economic,
social,
technological,
environmental,
and...
All right, PESTEL. And we're going to dive deep into each one now because the analysis we're drawing on uses some very specific, really tangible examples that illustrate exactly why a business might get completely blindsided if they only focus on their internal issues or their own past experiences.
Yeah, the examples are key. And the goal here isn't just to understand what each category means in isolation. It's really to understand how these categories intersect.
The intersections.
Because the most challenging resilience problems, the really wicked ones, they almost always occur at the junction, where 2 or 3 of these PESTLE factors slam together simultaneously.
Okay, let's start with P, political threats. This area covers things like changes in public policy, new regulations, or shifts in the overall geopolitical environment. It seems obvious, I guess, that political risk exists.
Right.
But it often feels like the most difficult one to actually plan for because it relies so much on the unpredictable nature of elections, international relations, that kind of thing.
It is unpredictable in their specifics, but predictable in the aggregate. Organizations often make the mistake, I think, of just monitoring the day-to-day headlines, the political noise.
Yeah, the drama.
Without really anticipating the underlying structural shifts that are coming. The source material highlights the direct impact of just regularly scheduled elections as a key predictable example.
Okay, how so?
Well, think about it. In the U.S., you have presidential elections every 4 years, congressional elections every 2 years, and state governments are constantly rotating, changing hands.
These aren't some theoretical what-ifs, then.
Yeah.
These are scheduled, inevitable changes that basically promise some level of regulatory turbulence down the line.
Exactly. The question isn't if policy will change after an election, but how much it will change and in which direction.
Right.
And the implication is that these electoral cycles inevitably usher in potentially major regulatory and policy shifts, and those eventually filter down and affect businesses, sometimes profoundly.
Think about sectors like energy or healthcare or big tech firms.
Absolutely. A shift in the administration or even just control of Congress can mean an entirely different regulatory burden almost overnight in some cases.
Okay, wait. If you're running a company, how do you realistically model for that kind of political landscape, especially when it's so polarized these days?
Yeah, that's the tough part.
Like if one candidate promises to, say, deregulate environmental controls completely, and the other promises the strictest enforcement in history. How do you decide whether to invest in new, cleaner infrastructure today?
That's exactly where the dynamic adjustment piece comes back in. Businesses, ideally, must anticipate both potential outcomes, or at least a range of outcomes, and model for that regulatory uncertainty.
Model for uncertainty.
Yes. You might need to invest in more flexible capital expenditure CapEx that can be easily adapted later. Or maybe you invest in technology that's inherently compliant with the stricter potential standard, even if the laxer one is temporarily in force.
Ah, okay. So you build to the higher standard just in case.
Potentially, yes. It means moving beyond simply monitoring the day-to-day political news and recognizing that political volatility creates legislative instability. And that instability necessitates strategic adjustments long before any new law is actually signed. You have to anticipate.
So going back to that example, if you're building a new manufacturing plant, you might install the higher efficiency emission scrubbers now, even if current law doesn't strictly demand it.
Right.
Knowing that a political shift next year could make it mandatory and retrofitting would be way more expensive.
Exactly. That's damage control beforehand, applied specifically to political risk.
You're investing proactively to secure your future operability, basically.
That's it. And notice the connection. You are using the political analysis, the P, to fortify yourself against a potential future legal vulnerability, the L. Yeah. That connection between P and L, it's essential. They're not isolated categories. Hashtag 3.2 economic threats.
Okay, moving from the ballot box to the balance sheet. Let's talk economic threats. This covers, the general health of the economy, inflation, labor costs, major changes in basic market conditions, things that can literally make or break an organization.
And the biggest challenge here, often, is planning for those massive, sometimes sudden, overarching economic policy shifts. Things that fundamentally alter global trade dynamics.
Okay.
The source material uses the Trump administration's aggressive tariff policy as a prime example here.
Right. I remember that dominating the news.
And it's a good example because this wasn't just slow, gradual inflation creeping up. It was a fundamental, sharp policy decision that profoundly impacted global supply chains, investor confidence, the stock market generally.
It introduced instant cost uncertainty, didn't it, for basically any business relying on international sourcing or manufacturing. Yeah. One day the cost is X, the next day it's X plus 25%.
Exactly. And what really stands out in the analysis of this example is the profound uncertainty it created. And for how long? Even years after implementation, the source material notes that the ultimate outcome is not yet clear.
Not yet clear. Even years later. Wow.
That's a huge strategic insight right there. How does a business plan effectively for an outcome that might not be fully settled or understood for half a decade, maybe longer?
That really stresses the long tail, the lasting impact of these fundamental shifts in trade policy.
It does.
If a tariff increases the cost of your essential materials by, say, 25%, that impacts your end consumers eventually, it disrupts your existing supply chains, it alters your profit margins overnight, and it forces immediate, possibly painful vendor renegotiations.
Right. And think about the strategic choice it forces. If you think that tariff might be temporary, maybe you try to absorb the cost, hoping it goes away.
Okay.
But if you suspect it might be permanent or part of a longer-term shift, you might have to fundamentally restructure your entire manufacturing footprint, maybe move production.
Which is a massive, expensive decision.
Hugely expensive. So you're forced to model for multiple long-term, potentially opposing economic scenarios. Like, Scenario A, tariffs ease up or normalize within 18 months, so we grit our teeth and wait them out.
Okay.
Scenario B, tariffs become the new normal or even increase, necessitating complete reshoring or maybe nearshoring or significant localization of the supply chain. And that requires immediate, very expensive capital investment.
And if you bet on Scenario A, waiting it out, but Scenario B actually happens, you could suddenly find yourself completely priced out of the market by competitors who adapted faster.
Precisely. It forces organizations to think about financial resilience, not just in terms of managing current cash flow, but in terms of adapting their entire cost structure, their entire supply chain strategy in response to government decisions that can drastically alter the global pricing landscape for years to come.
It's almost like an investment risk, but it's in your own operational location and structure.
That's a great way to put it. And moreover, these economic threats, they intersect constantly with other categories. Think about social threats through labor costs.
How so?
Well, if inflation is running high in your country, economic threat, and that pushes labor costs way up, economic social intersection, how does that affect your competitive advantage against international companies operating in different economic environments with lower labor costs? These factors are always moving, always interacting. Hashtag 3.3 social threats.
All right, next up is S, social threats. These feel incredibly dynamic and maybe the hardest to predict sometimes because they rely on, well, human behavior, collective sentiment, demographic shifts.
They are definitely tricky. We're looking at things like changes in consumer behavior, what people buy, why they buy it, what they stop buying. Also, community movements, activism, and those larger, slower-moving demographic trends.
And this is where we see the concept of secondary vulnerability come into play, right?
Yes, exactly. The source gives a really striking specific example from 2025. It describes a situation where individuals who had previously been, staunch supporters of electric vehicles suddenly turned aggressively against one particular EV manufacturer. In this case, it was Tesla.
Wait, why? Was there a major defect with the car or a big safety recall? Because that's usually what drives a consumer boycott, isn't it?
That's what you'd expect. But here's where it gets really interesting for resilience planning and highlights that secondary vulnerability. The protest wasn't directly about the car itself. It wasn't about the company's quality or even its labor practices.
What was it about?
The underlying cause, according to the source, was explicitly stated by the protesters to be anger against government policies that these consumers disagreed with.
Government policies?
Yes. And they chose to target the most visible symbol of the green transition, the EV company, in their region as a proxy for their anger at the government.
Wow. That's a fascinating and frankly terrifying insight for any company. The business becomes a proxy target for political or social frustration, even if they had nothing to do with the policy itself.
That is the critical lesson in secondary vulnerability. It highlights the profound risk of a business being targeted simply because of its perceived alignment or association with external political or social issues.
Perceived alignment, whether it's accurate or not, doesn't even matter.
Often, no. If the public believes you benefit from or support a policy they hate fairly or unfairly, your brand, safety, your reputation is instantly compromised. And that social threat manifests immediately as a direct economic impact through lost sales, bad press, reputation damage.
So resilience planning now has to include a dedicated strategy for managing that perceived alignment risk. You need to understand how geopolitical decisions or domestic policies might affect the social temperature around your brand, even indirectly.
Absolutely. It adds a whole new layer. But, we often focus only on those explosive, visible protests like the EV example.
Right.
The source also reminds us not to forget the slower, maybe more mundane level of social change. Things like gradual demographic shifts within a neighborhood or a region. This is more like the stealth threat.
Okay. How does that affect business resilience specifically? Seems less dramatic.
Less dramatic, but potentially just as damaging over time. Think about a shift in local demographics. Maybe it changes the average household income in the area, or the cultural preferences, or even just the primary language spoken. Does the local community now need multilingual staff and services where they didn't before?
Okay.
So if a local business, say a grocery store in a rapidly gentrifying area, fails to track these subtle, slow-moving social currents, they might keep stocking the same inventory that worked 5 years ago.
But it's wrong for the new resident.
Exactly. They slowly erode their local relevance, customers drift away, and suddenly they find themselves unprofitable, maybe facing closure, without ever having seen a single picket sign or experienced a sudden boycott.
So resilience requires that continuous scrutiny of your customer base, your community, adapting to those slow-moving social currents before they render your business model irrelevant.
Precisely. It's not just about weathering the storms, but also navigating the changing tides. Hashtag 3.4 technological threats. All right, moving on to T, technological threats. This is perhaps the most rapidly accelerating area we've discussed, the one forcing that continuous arms race we talked about earlier.
Yeah, it feels like something new pops up every week.
It really does. And these advances, they bring incredible benefits, obviously, driving efficiency, enabling new products and services. But they introduce an equal and sometimes opposite measure of new vulnerabilities, new ways for things to go wrong.
And the quintessential example right now, the one everyone's talking about, has to be artificial intelligence, AI.
Absolutely. It's the perfect example of a dual-use technology revolution. It's improving so many aspects of life and business, but the source material rightly notes the inherent and growing risk.
What's the core risk identified?
The core risk is that bad actors, criminals, state-sponsored groups are already using AI to perpetrate fraud and misinformation at an unprecedented scale and sophistication.
We're moving way beyond those, poorly written phishing emails with bad grammar.
Oh, far beyond. We're dealing with AI-generated deepfakes, video or audio of CEOs convincingly demanding urgent wire transfers. We're seeing automated, AI-driven misinformation campaigns designed specifically to tank a company's stock price before an earnings call, or even incite violence or panic.
Okay, this sounds less like just a traditional cybersecurity problem and more like a massive integrated threat. It touches reputation, physical security, corporate stability, everything.
It absolutely is. This new scale and type of fraud and misinformation, it directly impacts both businesses and their individual employees and customers. It creates a really pulling need for entirely new defensive strategies.
How so? What needs to change?
Well, for starters, you can't just rely on old firewalls or basic antivirus software against an exponentially more convincing AI-driven phishing campaign or deepfake attack. Your security team needs sophisticated AI detection tools now. But maybe even more importantly, staff across the entire company, from the front desk to the C-suite, need training in identifying this new breed of advanced digital impersonation and manipulation. Human awareness is still a critical layer.
Right. So what's the implication here for the overall resilience plan? How does AI change the game?
It necessitates, really demands, deep integration of cyber and physical security strategies. They can't be separate silos anymore.
Give me an example of that integration.
Okay. Imagine a sophisticated cyber breach that doesn't actually steal data. Not initially. Instead, it compromises the building's physical access control systems. It unlocks doors, disables cameras.
Allowing physical entry for theft or sabotage.
Exactly. Or conversely, think about those AI-driven misinformation campaigns we mentioned. They could be used to spread rumors online that lead to coordinated physical disturbances, protests, or even violence directed at a corporate office or a retail location.
Wow, okay. So the digital threat manifests physically.
We are way past the point where these vulnerabilities can be managed in isolation. Security resilience, going forward, has to be thought of as a single holistic function, blending cyber and physical defenses seamlessly. Hashtag tag 3.5 environmental threats.
Okay, next is E, environmental threats. This category seems to cover two main things. First, those sudden catastrophic natural disasters.
Yeah.
Floods, tornadoes, earthquakes, wildfires.
Those are the acute shocks.
And second, the longer-term, more structural changes being driven by things like climate change and sustainability expectations.
And we probably need to acknowledge that latter point first, briefly. Sustainability, it's just not optional anymore for most organizations.
It's become table stakes, hasn't it?
Pretty much. Customers demand it, investors scrutinize it, regulators are increasingly mandating it. Strong environmental, social, and governance ESG performance is expected.
And failing to meet those expectations.
It becomes a risk in itself. It can morph into a social threat if consumers turn against you, a legal threat if you fall foul of regulations, and an economic threat if it cripples your access to capital or top talent.
Yeah.
So ESG is now part of core resilience.
Got it. But let's focus on the immediate high-impact risks, too, those sudden catastrophic events. The source provides some really startling, very specific data from the catastrophic wildfires that hit Southern California back in December 2024. These figures, they truly illustrate the systemic nature of the shock.
Yeah, let's focus on the financial numbers from that event because they're staggering. The fires destroyed over 1,200 homes and significantly many commercial structures as well.
Okay.
The total damage estimate, it ranged between an astonishing $95 billion and $164 billion.
Wait, say those numbers again. 95 billion to 164 billion.
Yeah.
From one regional event.
Billion with a B, yes. Those numbers are just immense. How does a regional economy, or frankly even a national economy, begin to absorb a shockwave of that magnitude?
It's hard to fathom.
And within that, the insured losses alone reached $75 billion. Lost wages, just from the disruption, totaled an estimated $297 million.
Okay, so these figures represent far more than just the immediate destruction of buildings.
Far more. They represent a massive, sustained, systemic shock. And here's the crucial analytic point the source material really insists upon: the long-term impact on resource availability.
Resource availability? You mean beyond just the loss of the physical buildings themselves, like materials to rebuild?
Yes. Partly materials, but even more fundamentally. Critical resources like water, which is often impacted after major fires. Building materials become scarce and expensive, obviously. But maybe most importantly, skilled labor.
Oh, the workforce.
Exactly. The destruction of 1,200 homes doesn't just reduce the housing stock. It forces skilled workers, think about nurses, engineers, technicians, construction workers, people essential to the economy. It forces many of them to relocate, maybe permanently, simply because they have nowhere to live.
So that cripples the available labor pool for years to come, long after the fire is out.
Precisely. So a company whose own buildings weren't even damaged in the fire might suddenly find itself unable to operate effectively because the essential infrastructure around it, the roads, the utilities, and critically, the workforce has been permanently affected or diminished.
That's a profound ripple effect.
It forces a change in hiring strategies, maybe mandates massive relocation costs if you have to bring workers in, and it almost certainly drastically increases insurance costs for every single business in that region for years afterward.
So resilience planning has to account for these multi-year environmental ripple effects, not just the initial cleanup phase.
Absolutely. The environmental threat becomes a multi-year economic threat and a multi-year social threat all rolled into one. That intersection again. Hashtag 3.6 legal threats. Okay, finally, we reach L, legal threats. These are the direct impacts that come from specific courtroom decisions, the introduction of completely new laws, or changes in existing regulations. This area, in many ways, dictates the fundamental parameters within which every single organization has to operate.
Right, the rules of the game. And the source uses a perfect, very immediate example here. The restrictions imposed by the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, on emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases.
Yes, and this example illustrates the scope of legal threats well, because those are federal restrictions. They impact businesses right across the nation. But the context here is critical. Those federal restrictions are often just the baseline. They're frequently matched or even exceeded by laws implemented at the state or sometimes even local level.
Right. California is famous for having stricter environmental laws than the federal government, for instance.
Exactly. So if you're a national company or even just a multi-state business, you aren't dealing with just one neat set of regulations. You're dealing with a complex, potentially conflicting patchwork of state-level requirements that might be far more stringent in one jurisdiction than another.
That sounds like a compliance nightmare.
It can be. And let's bridge the abstract rule, like, say, new CO2 emission caps to the concrete business impact. Meeting a new EPA standard or a stricter state standard often requires significant, sometimes unexpected, capital expenditure.
Like what?
Upgrading machinery, changing core manufacturing processes, maybe altering long-term utility contracts to meet new renewable energy mandates imposed by law. If a state suddenly imposes a much stricter standard than you anticipated, you might find yourself having to decommission perfectly functional equipment years before you plan to, writing off that investment.
Ouch. The implication is crystal clear then. Legal changes can have a very direct, sometimes very sudden impact on your CapEx, your OpEx, and just fundamentally how your organization functions day to day.
Yes. Compliance and adaptation have to be handled across multiple jurisdictions simultaneously, requiring constant monitoring of legislative agendas and regulatory bodies.
It's not a one-time check.
Definitely not. This necessitates constant legal audits, or at least regular reviews. And crucially, it means integrating the legal analysis team directly into the operations planning and the budgeting cycles.
So legal isn't just the department that says no or checks contracts anymore.
They shouldn't be. They need to be strategic risk assessors. Their job is to translate abstract regulations and pending legislation into hard financial costs and potential operational restrictions before they hit.
So if your legal team spots an emerging, tougher EPA restriction coming down the pike,
that immediately informs your environmental planning, your technological investment decisions, and your economic forecasting. It connects everything back together. Legal becomes a proactive input to resilience, not just a reactive compliance function.
Okay, we spent a good amount of time establishing the why complacency is dangerous, why change is constant, and we've dug into the 6 pestle categories and how they intersect to create complex threats.
Right.
Now we need to transition into the how. What are the positive, concrete, fortifying actions that organizations need to take to actually develop that dynamic resilience capability we've been talking about?
Absolutely. And the source material introduces a really core philosophy here, which underpins the action plan. It's called the principle of uniform experience.
The principle of uniform experience. Okay, explain that for us. What exactly does that mean?
It's the philosophy, the idea that a business's instinct to survive, its resilience, is really born from the uniform experience of its various parts when under pressure.
Okay.
Think about it. When a company is under a significant threat, let's say a major cyber attack or a natural disaster hitting a key facility, every area feels the pinch, right?
Yeah, usually.
IT is scrambling to manage the breach or restore systems. HR is managing staff safety, communication, maybe trauma. Legal is dealing with liability, reporting requirements. Finance is managing cash flow impacts, insurance claims. Operations is trying to reroute production or services.
It hits everyone.
Exactly. The experience of the threat is uniform across the organization, even if the specific tasks differ. And so the principle states that every area must contribute to overcoming that challenge. Sometimes it's through common sense actions within their silo, but often true resilience emerges from counterintuitive responses that actually transcend those normal departmental boundaries. The uniform experience forces collaboration.
Okay, that makes sense conceptually. Can you give us a tangible example of one of those counterintuitive responses driven by this uniform experience?
Sure. Let's imagine a business identifies an emerging legal threat, maybe new state legislation is coming, that will severely restrict the use of certain types of cloud data storage due to heightened privacy concerns.
Okay, a specific L from Pistol.
Right. The legal department flags this immediately. Now, the obvious intuitive response is just for the IT department to find new compliance software or migrate data to a different server type.
Standard procedure.
But the counterintuitive response, driven by the uniform experience principle, goes further.
How so? What else happens?
Well, because everyone understands the legal risk is the driving factor, the uniform experience, IT realizes that moving the data isn't enough. They have to decommission the old hardware where the now non-compliant legacy data resided.
Ah, okay.
And that old hardware, now containing highly sensitive data under the new, stricter law, must be physically destroyed according to very strict regulatory standards to avoid future legal liability down the road.
Right, you can't just toss it in a dumpster.
Exactly. Which means, suddenly, the physical security team has to be involved. They need to establish a secure chain of custody for those old drives, manage the certified destruction process, maybe even train their security staff specifically on handling sensitive hardware disposal under these new rules.
Wow. Okay, so a legal threat immediately dictates a specific technical strategy, which in turn mandates a very concrete physical security procedure. And then maybe marketing and HR also need to get involved to update their internal training and external communications about how customer data is handled under the new privacy standards.
That's it. That's the entire business acting as one integrated system to overcome a single challenge that originated in the legal category. That's the dynamic, uniform response we need to aim for.
It really demands breaking down those internal silos we keep talking about. They just get in the way of this kind of response.
They absolutely do. Which leads us nicely into the specific action steps. Take 4.1, conduct regular audits.
Okay, so the first concrete step recommended is actually deceptively simple on the surface. Conduct regular audits.
Simple to say, harder to do well consistently.
Right. This means setting up a recurring schedule for the routine review of both physical and cybersecurity measures, not just one or the other.
And the emphasis here really has to be on routine and scheduled, a quick check once a year. That's just not sufficient anymore, not in a world where AI threats evolve weekly and geopolitical risk can shift overnight.
So audits should be more continuous, like an ongoing process, not just a big annual event.
Ideally, yes, or at least much more frequent and dynamic. And you're not just looking at a compliance checklist ticking boxes. You should be actively stress testing the assumptions that underlie your security posture.
How do you mean stress testing assumptions?
Like asking, are our physical locks and access controls really sufficient against the kind of sophisticated physical breach techniques we know exist now? Is our current cyber defense stack actually capable of detecting a well-crafted, AI-generated intrusion attempt, or just the old clumsy ones? You have to test against the current threat level, not yesterday's.
Okay, so the goal of these scheduled audits is basically preventative maintenance for your entire business structure, your resilience structure.
That's a great way to think about it. They are absolutely key to catching vulnerabilities before they get exploited. And critically, the findings from these audits should feed directly back into the pestle review cycle we talked about.
Ah, closing the loop.
Exactly. Ensuring that any weakness identified in an audit, say, a gap in physical security around data centers, is immediately cross-referenced against potential external threats, like maybe increased activism, social, or specific technological threats targeting infrastructure. Tag 4.2, collaborate across departments. And that links directly back to that principle of uniform experience we discussed. Action item number 2 is collaborate across departments. You absolutely must foster constant communication and joint planning among teams for truly all-inclusive threat management.
We've all seen the failure state of this, right? The IT team knows a major server upgrade and planned outage is happening on Tuesday, but operations doesn't get the memo, so they try to run a critical production system right during the blackout. Chaos ensues.
Classic silo problem. Breaking down those silos seems basic, almost cliche, but it remains a massive challenge, especially in larger, more established organizations with entrenched departmental cultures.
So how do you foster genuine collaboration beyond just sending more emails?
Well, one effective tactic is to institute joint threat workshops. Get legal, IT, HR, operations, physical security, maybe even communications in the same room, physically or virtually, on a regular basis, say quarterly.
Okay.
And the specific agenda for these workshops should be discussing the latest pestle analysis and then brainstorming potential vulnerabilities and responses based on that uniform experience model. How does this political trend affect our combined operations?
The benefit there, I imagine, is you get that truly integrated view. The HR team's insight into, say, rising staff attrition in a key location because of skyrocketing local housing costs, that's a social economic threat.
Right.
That insight can directly inform the operations team that maybe they need to start seriously considering diversifying manufacturing or service locations to mitigate that labor risk.
Exactly. An insight that absolutely never happens if HR is just focused on recruitment metrics and operations is just focused on production uptime, operating in their separate silos.
So breaking down the silos ensures that every department's unique perspective, their unique lens on a potential threat, contributes to overcoming the challenge collectively.
It transforms isolated vulnerability information into shared, actionable intelligence across the entire organization. Hashtag 4.3, continually update.
Step 3 follows logically. Continually update. This is really the practical, ongoing application of the pestle analysis we spent so much time unpacking earlier.
Yes. Use the pestle framework not as a one-time report, but as a living tool. Something you use actively to keep an eye on possible emerging threats and adjust your strategies accordingly.
So pestle shouldn't be a document that gets filed away and gathers dust on a shelf after the annual strategy meeting.
Absolutely not. It needs to be reviewed regularly as a core piece of business intelligence. Ideally, maybe key elements are reviewed monthly or at least quarterly, specifically looking for shifts in any of those 6 categories.
What kind of shifts?
Has a new technological advancement suddenly introduced a novel fraud risk? Has a social movement started gaining significant traction online that could impact our brand perception? Has a proposed piece of legislation, legal, moved closer to becoming law? Did a recent environmental event expose a supply chain vulnerability we hadn't considered?
And crucially, when a significant shift is identified in that review, the strategy must immediately pivot, or at least be reevaluated.
That's the key. It has to trigger action. If your pestle scan shows that geopolitical tension, is rapidly rising between 2 nations where you have key suppliers, you immediately check your supply chain dependencies, economic, assess the potential impact, and proactively start seeking and vetting alternative suppliers before any sanctions hit or borders close.
It keeps the strategy dynamic, alive. You're not reacting to the crisis itself when it happens. You're adjusting your defenses, your posture, based on the pestle intelligence you've gathered about the shifting landscape beforehand.
It moves you permanently into that damage control beforehand mindset we keep coming back to. It becomes the default way of operating. Hashtag 4.4 plan for scenarios.
Okay, and finally, the 4th action step. We must plan for scenarios. This means preparing detailed contingency plans, playbooks, if you will, for the different kinds of threats that might arise, especially those complex combined threats we noted earlier where multiple pestle factors hit at once.
Exactly. This is where we really stress test the entire system and the integration we've been talking about. Scenario planning means moving beyond simple tests like, what if we lose power for 8 hours, to much more complex, multi-layered combinations. For example, what if the economic threat of a major new tariff on imported components combines with the environmental threat of a major wildfire that cripples our primary West Coast distribution hub, and that happens during peak season when we're already facing a tight labor market social?
Wow, okay, that sounds like a really bad day.
A really bad day, but thinking through those complex, plausible, even if low probability combined scenarios is essential. What breaks first? Where are the hidden dependencies? Who makes which decisions?
And the goal here is enabling quick, decisive, and effective action when a real crisis hits, right?
Precisely. If you've already wargamed complex, combined scenarios like that, You move from being potentially paralyzed by the sheer unexpectedness and complexity of it all
Yeah, deer in the headlights.
to immediately executing a pre-planned, coordinated response. A response that's hopefully already been dictated and agreed upon using that principle of uniform experience involving all the necessary departments.
You need to ask those really difficult what-if questions during peacetime, essentially.
We absolutely do. Questions like, who is actually in charge if the CEO and key executives are unreachable during a major physical event? Where are the pre-allocated emergency resources directed when two very different types of threats, say a cyber attack and a supply chain collapse, hit simultaneously? Which one takes priority, or how are they managed in parallel?
That level of detailed scenario planning, it must drastically increase the odds of survival and minimize recovery time.
It does, because the organization doesn't have to stop and debate the fundamental strategy in the middle of the panic. It knows the playbook. It just needs to execute. #tag outro.
So after all that, what does this really mean for you, the listener, running your business or managing your team? The takeaway from this deep dive seems crystal clear. Business resilience. It's just not a passive state you achieve by ticking a box or surviving one bad quarter.
No, it really isn't. It is a continuous dynamic capability, something that requires constant scrutiny, constant questioning at all levels of the business, and critically, pushing past that very tempting, very human trap of historical complacency, thinking you've seen it all before.
Because the world is simply changing too fast, too unpredictably for static strategies to work anymore. The only viable path forward seems to be anticipation.
Anticipation, absolutely, aided by simple yet powerful organizing tools like Pestle. By systematically breaking down that complex, overwhelming external threat landscape into those 6 manageable categories.
Political, economic, social, technological, environmental, legal.
Right. Organizations can then start to move proactively. They can actually do that damage control beforehand we talked about, fortifying every part of the business against inevitable disruption, not just hoping it won't happen to them.
It requires recognizing, fundamentally, that what collapses in a crisis often isn't just one thing. It's usually the weakest link in your entire integrated system, your supply chain, your IT, your people, your reputation. Therefore, your defense structure, your resilience capability, it has to be just as dynamic, just as integrated, and continually audited and updated as the threats themselves.
Well said. And maybe I can leave you, the listener, with one final thought. Something to maybe mull over that builds on this source material, and especially those Pestle intersections we highlighted. Think about the biggest single threat, or maybe the one that worries you most facing your specific organization or industry right now. Try to categorize it. Is it primarily political, economic, social, tech, environmental, legal?
Got it. Pick one main threat.
Now here's the provocative part. Consider how that primary threat is being, or could be, significantly exacerbated, made worse, by a completely different, maybe even counterintuitive factor from one of the other 5 Pestle categories.
Okay, find an unexpected connection.
Exactly. For instance, if you run what seems like a purely secure technological product or service, how might a sudden change in local, state-level environmental restrictions on, say, water usage impact your data center cooling operations? Could that force a massive, unexpected new infrastructure investment you hadn't budgeted for?
The E hitting the T.
Or how could a fresh geopolitical tension flare-up, political, suddenly affect the public's social response, social, to your product, not because of anything your product actually does, but simply because of which country your company is headquartered in, or who your major investors are perceived to be, that perceived alignment risk again.
Those counterintuitive connections, that's where the really deep resilience thinking happens, isn't it?
I believe so. The deepest vulnerabilities and the strongest resilient strategies often lie at those unexpected intersections, so keep digging, keep asking those tough questions, keep adjusting.
And we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
Thanks for listening to the Cash News Podcast. We hope you found this episode insightful. Don't forget to like and review us on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your podcast. Follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter, and be sure to visit us at thecashnews.com to stay up to date with the latest on the world of cash. Thanks again for listening to the Cash News Podcast.